Today, this presentation discusses how agriculture has changed the lives of Native Americans over the last 300 years. The first government officials after the Revolutionary War were all in agreement that Native Americans own their land and that the land must be bought from the Indians before it can be sold to settlers. Even the Supreme Court in 1795 declared that both before and after the Revolution, the soil belonged to the Aborigines until they sold it. With the relationship these officials had with the Native Americans, they had no way of foreseeing what would happen in the years to come. Many Native American cultures were farmers for thousands of years before white settlers showed up. But in the early 19th century, Euro-Americans started questioning the agricultural practices of the natives, eventually accusing them of not being true farmers at all. The way Euro-Americans farmed was much different than the ways of the Native Americans they encountered, and accused them of being sloppy farmers who did not care for their land. This accusation gave Euro-Americans reason to force natives off their land. Since they did not farm the land, they were just occupying it, a very different view from those just several decades earlier. They used the excuse that natives were hunters, therefore they moved around and could not own the land they did not truly live on. So now the white leaders of the time could divvy up the land and sell it to white settlers driving the Indians westward. This was the start of the removal of many Native American tribes in the United States across the Mississippi westward. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was supposed to be a voluntary act of those tribes involved, but the government under President Jackson put a lot of pressure on the leaders of the tribes to sign the treaties that forced their movement westward. This removal brought on the deaths of 80,000 Native American people between 1828 and 1838. This was the time of the infamous Trail of Tears. For many Native tribes, this meant learning many things all over again. For medicine people and those who used plants for different things had to learn what was okay to use and what could possibly be deadly to not only themselves, but to those they may help. But what they were unaware of was how popular westward expansion would become in the years that followed, because now that natives were deemed to be uncivilized, had no real knowledge of the land other than hunting, and were not doing enough for themselves, the government decided to try and assimilate Native Americans into white society. The Dawes Allotment Act of 1887 was the biggest player in trying to civilize natives into white culture. The idea was that Native American families would be allotted a certain plot of land to use as farmland. They figured they could assimilate natives by using farming as a tool to make these families stay in one place and become functioning members of society. What they failed to realize is that it would take a lot more than just farming to assimilate an entire group of people. The overconfidence of the policymakers during this time was one of the main reasons why the Dawes Act failed the way it did, because the government was trying to implement their own laws, education, and ways of life into a nation of people who already had a set way of life. The Indians took what they learned and made their tribal laws stronger and kept their traditions with them. As the natives were forced into smaller amounts of land and forced to live in closer proximity to one another, their traditions had no sure way of being eliminated. The policymakers had not fully thought through their plan to kill the Indian and save the man. Farming for many Native Americans was a way of life before white settlers encroached on native soil. Although during this time there were treaties made to give natives access to ceded land from previous years, natives today are still facing issues with control over these lands. Native people are aware that land and resources are essential to the sovereignty of indigenous nations and that taking away what they fought so hard to protect will not be easy. Today there are Native artists that use their work to show their distaste for how careless some government policies that are geared towards helping the land, but really have destroyed that of Native people, really are. Jolene Rickard of the Tuscarora Nation indicates in her installation called Corn Blue Room the effects of modern technology and in particular the hydroelectric project that took a third of her community's land. Many Native Americans are unable to farm the land in which they live on because reservations today are known to be in the worst areas for it. Although whites try to use farming as a tool to assimilate natives, what they really did was force some of a culture to lose their ancestral practices of farming to maintain their way of life.